Yeah, I was not going to give my share on Tu B'Shvat, but I will say just a few words. Tu B'Shvat almost always falls either during the week of Parshas B'Shalach or immediately after Parshas B'Shalach. And there actually is an interesting connection. We know that the Shabbat of Parshas B'Shalach is called Shabbat Shira, the Shabbat of song, because that is the singing of Oz Yashir when we cross the Red Sea. But it is recorded that there was an old minhag, mainly among Ashkenazim, that we would feed the birds on Shabbos. We would leave food for the birds on Shabbat Shira. And the origin of that is based on the fact that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu had the man fall, which falls in this parsha, so he stipulated that one cannot leave any man over till the next day, and no man would fall on Shabbos, and on Friday you would get a double portion to cover Shabbos. So Dasan and Aviram wanted to discredit Moshe Rabbeinu, as was their wont. So Shabbos, they took the man that was given to them on Shabbos and they scattered it outside so they could point to the idea, oh, you see, the man did fall on Shabbos. So the birds came and ate the man. So when Dasan and Aviram wanted to pull everybody out and show them that the man fell on Shabbos, there was no man around. So because we're grateful to the birds because of their eating of the man, therefore it was customary to feed the birds. Now halachically, actually, this minhag raises a number of interesting questions, because halachically you're actually not supposed to feed wild animals on Shabbat that are able to fend for themselves, because that is treated as unnecessary labor. If it's your dog, your cat, that depends on you, so of course you must feed them. But if it's an animal that fends for itself, you're not supposed to put out. Okay, but nevertheless, there are various defenses of the minhag. Now, what do you see from this minhag? You actually see three ideas in gratitude. Number one, that gratitude is not only to people, but even to animals, that there's a certain gratitude to animals. Number two, it is intergenerational, because obviously the birds that you're feeding today are not the birds that actually ate the man. And number three, you see that gratitude applies even if the intention was a selfish intention. We can assume that the birds weren't eating it in order to validate Moshe Rabbeinu. They were eating it because it looked good. But that doesn't make a difference. L'maaseh, it was a chesed. And this teaches us that gratitude applies on all levels. So even the people who get paid for their services, we have to feel grateful. Now, the reason why this is relevant to Tu B'Shvat is Tu B'Shvat is not necessarily a major holiday in the Jewish calendar, but Tu B'Shvat is a time in which we assess our relationship to our external environment. It is kind of the Jewish Earth Day, although it is much deeper than that. And at least one of the elements of how we are mityaches to our environment is that we have to have hakaras hatov to the earth itself. The earth, the water, the air, these are gifts that Hashem has given us, and we owe it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our children and future generations, and strangely enough, we even owe it to the earth, the water, and the air, that there's a certain element of hakarat hatov, not to abuse them, not to diminish them, not to destroy the goodness that they give. Now, you may ask me a question. Well, I showed you hakarat hatov to birds, okay, but where do you find hakarat hatov to inanimate things like air or earth? Well, you find that as well. If you remember, the first makkah of blood had to be effected by Aaron striking the Nile and turning the water into blood. It could not be effected by Moshe Rabbeinu. Why not? Because the Nile had given him protection and shelter when he was put on the Nile and found by Bitya Bas Paro. So Moshe Rabbeinu owed a debt of gratitude to the Nile, and therefore he could not be the direct instrument of turning it into blood. So gratitude applies even to the water, right? The air, the earth, and the like. And that's what Tu B'Shvat is. So in some ways, Again, I don't want to suggest at all, and you'll have a Tu B'Shvat Seder that will go into the very, very deep Kabbalistic ideas that the human soul is compared to a tree. That's not my topic tonight. But even on a basic, simple level, a religious Jew ought to be environmentally conscious. And I have to say that unfortunately, sometimes we are a little lax in that department. Part of it is the crowded conditions of living in a city, etc. But when you see trash in the street, and especially in Eretz Yisrael, one that should really hurt us, because Eretz Yisrael should not only be holy, but because it's holy, it should also be beautiful, and one should not besmirch it in any way. So Tu B'Shvat is a little bit of an opportunity to focus on our connection to the environment. So I'm not saying, you can't use styrofoam, plastic. That's your own decision. I'm not pushing any particular environmental agenda, but the concept of not littering, the concept of hakaras hatov for the air, the water, the ground. All of this is very, very important. And as we see from the parsha of Shabbat Shira, the inyan of hakaras hatov is intergenerational, and it even applies to non-human actors. So that was my little spiel about Tu B'Shvat, at least on the most basic level of thinking about the environment. Somebody told me a story. It's an awful story. Really, it made me very, very upset, about a religious couple, very, very religious couple, and they wanted to have a picnic on Shabbos. They wanted to have their Suda in a park. Okay, if they rely on the Erev, so you can have a Suda in the park. But at the end, they did not dispose of their garbage on the picnic table, because they said, garbage is muktzah, not allowed to move it. So here's the thing. First of all, there are plenty of heterim to move it. But if you're going to be machmir and you're not going to move garbage, then you don't have a picnic. That's as simple as that. What gives you the right to have a picnic when you know ahead of time you're not going to remove your garbage? That is mamish gezel of other people. You're stealing from other people their enjoyment of parkland, of public land, and the like. So one has to be very, very careful. The Gemara gives an amazing story. The Gemara in Bava Kama gives the story of a man who was clearing rocks from his field. There were boulders, and he was throwing them into the street. So the Chacham said to him, "Why are you taking rocks from land that is not yours and throwing it into land that is yours?" So the guy didn't understand what he was being told. It's the opposite. I'm removing the rocks from land that is mine. But the Gemara goes on and said that he was delinquent in his taxes to the Roman government. The Roman government confiscated his property. He lost it. And he was wandering the streets. And he was tripping and stumbling and bruising himself on the very rocks that he had thrown into the street. And now he says, now I understand. I was removing rocks from property that is not mine, and I threw it into the property that I myself am using. So as the saying in English goes, what goes around comes around, or is it what comes around goes around? I always forget which order it is. But that's one of the ideas that we should remember as well. So, indeed, in the United States at least, I'm sure they must have a similar organization in Israel. There actually are environmental organizations that are Torah-oriented, that there are religious, orthodox, halachic organizations that are committed to environmental protection. So if that is a cause that appeals to you, I think it is a legitimate cause, it's an important cause, it's a worthy cause, and especially in Eretz Yisrael, even more than Chutz La'aretz, because the Alter of Slobodka used to say that part of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is not only living here, but to make Eretz Yisrael a more livable country. When you pick up a piece of trash in this land, you are doing the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. So it goes beyond simply physically living here, as important as that mitzvah is. Okay, so that's my little Tu B'Shvat commercial, but as I say, there are obviously very, very deep Kabbalistic meanings as well, and you will discover that the Mekubalim of Tzfat, in the time of the Arizal, created a whole Seder of Tu B'Shvat, including 4 cups of wine, different types of fruits, and I will leave that for the wonderful Seder that you will undoubtedly experience. Okay. Now going back to the splitting of the Red Sea, which is the main event in the Parsha, the splitting of the Red Sea is, of course, the conclusion of Yetziat Mitzrayim. In fact, we celebrate that on the 7th day of Pesach. Everyone knows, well, first let me start off this way. Chazal have an interesting drasha that in the panic of Kriyas Yamsuf, the Jewish people were terrified. They literally were between a rock and a hard place. They're looking at this ocean, this sea, the Red Sea. Of course, as you know, Red Sea is obviously a mistranslation. It's Yam Suf, is Reed Sea. Okay, so it's not the Red Sea, but okay, be it as it may, we call it, no, the name is now the Red Sea, at least in English. And they're facing this water, and they have the Egyptian army with their chariots coming after them. And they are terrified, they are horrified, they are devastated with fear, they are paralyzed with fear. So first, the Ibn Ezra asks the obvious question. How many Jews are here? You have 600,000 men from the age of 20 and up, and people under 20 and women, etc. Conservative estimates are you have 3 million people. Now, the Egyptian army is described as have 600 chariots, but they certainly didn't have 3 million foot soldiers. So, the Jewish people could easily, it would appear, defeat the Egyptians, just numerically. There just were so many more of them. Why are they so horrified? Why are they paralyzed? And the Ibn Ezra makes an interesting psychological point that this is slave mentality. The Egyptians were their masters for so many years. And they're finally being freed and they experience 10 plagues. But when the master comes after them, they get frightened. They lose their courage. And they panic. And they don't know what to do. In fact, the Ibn Ezra makes a fascinating point. This is actually why the Redeemer of Israel himself, Moshe Rabbeinu, could not have grown up as a slave. You wonder, why was it so necessary? Moshe Rabbeinu's life was a very unusual life before he took the Jews out of Egypt. He grows up in Paro's house as an adopted son of the king. And when he runs off to Midian, Chazal give him a whole other story. He was a king in Ethiopia for many, many years. He was a royal figure. He never partook of the slavery experience of his brethren. In fact, I've said before that I speculate that is why Dasan and Aviram didn't like Moshe Rabbeinu so much. Because they said, who gives this guy the right to be the leader if he didn't suffer as a slave in Mitzrayim? Unlike Dasan and Aviram, who were taskmasters, who got beaten for not reporting on the Jews. Right? I mean, put yourself psychologically in Dasan and Aviram's shoes. They're saying, we suffered, we were beaten. And here's this guy who grew up as in Paro's house, and all of a sudden he becomes the great liberator. Now, obviously, this is foolish. Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest of all Nevi'im. But from a purely human perspective, you can actually understand a little bit the tremendous jealousy that Dasan and Aviram had to Moshe Rabbeinu. And remember, Dasan and Aviram were actually righteous because they were the 1/5 that were saved, right? So they're not like this totally bad Rishayim that we portray them as. So the Ibn Ezra says the reason why the Redeemer of Israel had to grow up in freedom is had he grown up as a slave, his spirit would have been crushed, and he would not have been able to inspire the Jewish people to strive for freedom. The Ibn Ezra makes a big point about slave mentality. In fact, a similar phenomenon, I think it's called the Stockholm Syndrome. You may remember this is when people who are kidnapped for long periods of time, even when they're given their freedom, they don't leave. Sometimes kidnappers, who hold people for years, will throw open the door and say, you want to go? Go. And the person doesn't go. The person literally, it's almost like there's an electronic leash on them that holds them back. And that's why the Jews complained in the desert. Let's go back to the good old days of Egypt, right? The great old days of Egypt. The onion and the garlic and the fish and everything else. Because, being a slave has its compensations, frankly, on some level. Because you know your schedule. You're told what to do. You don't have to make the decisions of a free person. In fact, if you know American history, you'll know that after the Civil War, that was also a dilemma in terms of many free slaves didn't know what to do with themselves, so to speak. They didn't have any sense of direction. So, to go further with this, Chazal tell us, in the panic of the moment, the Jews split into 4 groups. They didn't know what to do. One group said, let us jump into the sea, not in the belief it'll split, but let's commit suicide. Let's jump into the sea, let's commit suicide. Another group said, let us fight the Egyptians. And a third group said, let us call out to the nations of the world, the United Nations, to save us. I always thought that was the most foolish of the groups. And the fourth group said, let us just return to Egypt and be slaves again. Now, all 4 of these groups are criticized. Again, even the group that said jump into the sea was not Nachshon ben Aminadav who jumped into the sea. It was a sense of let's just commit suicide. So someone who understands that besides the literal medrash of these 4 groups, it really has a symbolic meaning. Because everything in the Torah is a precursor for future events. We say Maisa Avos, what happened to our patriarchs, is a sign of what's going to happen to us. And Avos is Lav Dafka, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It also applies to the Shvatim, to the Dor HaMidbar. Everything is, to use a fancy word, paradigmatic. Everything is kind of establishing a pattern for what's going to happen. Based on this, some want to say that the raging waters of the Yam Suf refers to the secular torrential challenges that a Jew faces in modern society. Right? We face so many challenges living in a secular society, a godless world. And how do we navigate those challenges? And historically, there have been 4 responses of the Jewish people that are incorrect, that are dysfunctional. And let's show how they fit in. The first is jump into the water and commit suicide. Well, metaphorically, that just means total assimilation. If the water represents the attractions of the secular world, jumping into the water simply means we will embrace all that secular world offers, and we will abandon the distinctiveness of our Jewish identity, which really is a form of suicide. I mentioned last week that Herzl's vision of secular Zionism. And again, I want to re-emphasize that I am not at all critical of Herzl as a person. I believe his motives were absolutely fine and pure motives. He cared about the Jewish people tremendously. But his vision was incorrect in the sense that he thought the solution to the anti-Semitism of Europe that emerged from the Dreyfus trial, that kind of stirred him up, would be eliminated if the Jews would just be like all the other nations of the world, have their own land, have their own army. They even attribute, I think to Ben Gurion maybe, that we've really made it when we have our own bank robbers and criminals. We will be kachol hagoyim. That is the response of jumping into the water. But that is suicide. And ultimately it doesn't really help you, because it is no accident that the country in Europe where the process of assimilation had proceeded the furthest was in fact Germany, out of which came the Holocaust. Again, this is a very complicated issue, and it's a painful issue, and it's a controversial issue. But there is no accident that one of the sad lessons of the Holocaust, again, I'm not saying it's a reason, I'm just saying it's a lesson after the fact. One of the sad lessons of the Holocaust is that you can't escape being a Jew by trying to obliterate your identity. Because Hitler frankly didn't care. Hitler didn't care if you were a practicing Jew or not. Hitler didn't care if you were converted to Christianity. There were, in fact, there is a saint of the Catholic Church. And she was canonized, Edith Stein, she was canonized as a martyr to her faith because she died in Auschwitz as a Jew. She didn't die because she was Catholic. Right? So, again, I'm not giving reasons. It's not for me to give a reason. But it is a lesson that to try to escape the problems of anti-Semitism by obliterating your Jewish identity is not going to work. In fact, there's an old saying in Yiddish that when Jews don't make Kiddush, the Goyim will make Havdalah, separate and the like. Okay. Now, the second response was, let us return to Egypt. Let us be slaves. So this might be the idea of, so the first is assimilation, that's jumping into the water. The second might be what you call fragmentation. Now fragmentation is actually a very common modality. That's the double life, in which I will be a Jew at home, when I go to shul, my Shabbos table, but when I'm in the world, I will be a citizen of the world. In other words, I will not bring my Jewish values into my secular life. And hence you can have the phenomenon of a religious person who might be dishonest in business or cutthroat competitiveness. That's the notion of a slave, because a slave also has a bifurcated existence. He is working for the service of the master, and then at home he has his little tiny zone of privacy. So that's schizophrenic fragmentation. So jumping into the sea is assimilation. Going back to Egypt is fragmentation. Right? Moses Mendelssohn famously said, be a Jew at home and a man of the world in the world. Now, the third idea is, let us appeal to the nations of the world. That is Jewish identity based on victimization. And that's an issue today. Obviously, we have to remember the Shoah. But if you think about it, to build Jewish identity on all the bad things that have happened to the Jewish people is basically saying, you got to be Jewish because there's so much anti-Semitism in the world, there's so many Hitlers in the world, etc. But that just tells you what you're against. That doesn't tell you what you're for. So a Jewish identity that is built on being a professional victim has no staying power. And that is why we find, unfortunately, that the two pillars that used to attract non-religious college students to be interested in Judaism, the two pillars were Israel and Holocaust memory. And unfortunately, although Birthright improved the Israel a little bit, but unfortunately those two pillars do not have that staying power anymore. We know, unfortunately, on college campuses how many Jewish students are actively anti-Israel. It's shocking and horrendous. And we also know, litzarenu, that many of the younger generation are no longer interested in the Holocaust. They say it didn't happen to us. It happened more than 70 years ago. You got to go on. You got to move on. Because you can't communicate Jewish identity by saying what we're against. You have to establish it based on what we believe, what we're for. Okay, so again, jumping into the sea is assimilation. Going back to Egypt is fragmentation. Appealing to the nations of the world as a victim is victimization. And then we have the last one, let us wage war against Egypt. Now this is an interesting one. This we will call ghettoization. And this is actually a very religious response. This basically says the world is evil, the world is corrupt, the world is degenerate. I will relentlessly fight against everything out there and retreat into a voluntary ghetto of the mind. Now that sounds very, very religious. That is the most religious of all of these responses. It basically says everything outside of the Beit HaMidrash is treif and chazer. I don't want it. But based on this explanation, although that is by far the best of the four incorrect responses, because it does acknowledge the primacy of Torah, it is also an erroneous response, because it is cutting yourself and your family off from potential good that exists in the world at large. What do Chazal say? If someone tells you, Chachma Bagoyim, there is wisdom and insight and knowledge amongst even the Gentiles, Ta'amin, believe it. And indeed, there's a passage from the Vilna Gaon that says, for every measure of secular wisdom that a person is missing, he will be missing 10 times as much Torah as a result of his ignorance. So it is, of course, a challenge to be able to embrace secular wisdom and culture and not have it undermine your connection to Torah and mitzvahs. Right, this was Rav Hirsch's view, Torah im derech eretz, in a more modern incarnation, Torah Amada, and people at Yeshiva University debate endlessly over the difference between Torah Amada and Torah im derech eretz. Okay, and that's an interesting discussion, but the common denominator of them both is the notion that one integrates from the secular world ideas that one can then incorporate in their Torah and in their Avodat Hashem, and therefore their relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to Am Yisrael will be richer and deeper than it would be had they simply neglected all of those wisdoms. So therefore, this is a very, hopefully it's an interesting allegorical interpretation that the four groups at the Yam Suf, which represent dysfunctional, incorrect responses, represent the assimilation, the fragmentation, the victimization, the ghettoization, and all four are incorrect. Rather, the correct response is that of Nachshon. Jump into the water, meaning confront that secular world, but do so with emunah, that Hashem will give you a path to navigate through those waters. Not as the person who is totally assimilating, but the person who is willing to take the good and then apply it in their Avodat Hashem. Again, I'm going to admit that it may be that ghettoization is sometimes the lesser of two evils, meaning to say there are indeed so many dangers in the secular world that debase you, that degrade you, that can take you away from Torah, that I can respect a person who's made a decision that I need to isolate. But that is a lesser of two evils, meaning it is an evil. It is not an optimal choice, but it might be the better of two bad alternatives. In fact, it's been well said. I remember when Rav Soloveitchik was nifter. That was back, I guess, 1980. I don't remember, but it was either, I think it was 97. Yeah, 97. So this was a dilemma for the Jewish Observer. Jewish Observer was the Aguda magazine. Because on one hand, Rav Soloveitchik was a Rosh Yeshiva at YU for more than 50 years. He was one of the Gedolei Hador. He had thousands of Talmidim. You couldn't ignore him. On the other hand, he had a PhD in philosophy. He was not the model of the Aguda Rosh Yeshiva. So Aguda always wrote big biographies, or Moshe Feinstein, or Vago Kamenetsky, the Stipler, right? They had huge biographies. But what could they do for Rav Soloveitchik? They couldn't ignore it, but they also didn't want to give him the same treatment they would give to the standard Gadol. So they did something that to this day, the Jewish Observer is now defunct anyway, but to this day it infuriates the Talmidim of Rav Soloveitchik, some other people as well. And they wrote like a half-page thing instead of the typical 5 or 6 page story. And the way they said it was, actually it was kind of a brilliant way of saying it. They said, Rav Soloveitchik was absolutely unique in the way he was able to integrate secular and religious ideas, and therefore, although he was unique in his greatness, but uniqueness is not necessarily a model that can be emulated by others. That was clever. I mean, it might be infuriating, but that actually is a clever way of doing it. You might call it damning by faint praise, or you might call it recognizing his uniqueness. They had the same problem in Bnei Brak from a different angle. There was a gadol in Bnei Brak, Rav Gedalia Nadal, who was a great person. He was a Talmud of the Chazon Ish. He was a Chavrusa of Rav Chaim Kanevsky. But he was a very independent person. He refused to take money for Torah learning. So he had a parnasa. He was a farmer part of the time. He was a contractor. But he was a gadol. He was like a gadol. So he also had controversial ideas about the age of the earth and dinosaurs. He had different, very out of the box ideas. And unlike Nosson Slifkin, that you could push around because he was just a kid, what Rav Nadal said could not be ignored because he was a true gadol by every traditional definition. So once again, when he died, Rav Chaim Kanevsky used the same line. I guess he didn't get it from the Jewish Observer. He said, he was unique in the generation, meaning what he did, only he could do. No one else should follow that particular path. So I understand the dilemma, but nevertheless, the point is ghettoization is not the optimal approach. It may be the necessary approach in some circumstances, but one should not tout it as the optimal highest level of Avodas Hashem. So that's the idea of the four groups in the Yam Suf. But now I want to mention another point, and that is, all of us know the famous medrash that when Hashem closed the sea on the Egyptians, the Malachei Hashares wanted to sing Hashem's praises. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, no, Maseh Yadai Tavu Bayam. My creatures, the Egyptians, are drowning in the sea. They're also my creatures. V'yatem Omrim Shira? You want to sing in joy to me while the Egyptians are drowning? This is not a time of joy, this is a time of sadness. Now, please note, Hashem is not saying, oh, I'm not going to kill the Egyptians because they're my creatures. Hashem kills them, they have to die. We are not pacifists. Habal lahargecha, someone who comes to kill you, you kill them first. But when you kill them, you do so with sadness. You do so with regret that it's come to this. Golda Meir famously said, again, actually maybe infamously said, that we can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. Again, that's the part that many people deeply resent. I'm not endorsing that. But she said we can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. We cannot forgive the Arabs for making us kill their children. So I do not associate myself with the first part of her remark, but the second part does reflect a Jewish truth, that there is a notion that even the death of an evildoer is a tragedy, because every human being is made in the image of God, and every human being has the potential to be holy and good and noble. And when a human being destroys that potential by acts of violence and sin and evil, it is not just a tragedy to the victims of his evil. It is a tragedy to the evildoer himself because of what the life could have become. And Hashem grieves over the victims, and Hashem grieves over the perpetrators. Quite amazing. This is a remarkable statement that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is quoted as having commiseration and compassion for the Egyptians, even though they had to die. God is not calling off the death sentence. Now this idea actually has a halachic implication. As you know, on the first day of Pesach and at the Seder, we say a complete Hallel, Hallel Shalem. But all the other days of Pesach, including the last day of Pesach, we only say a Chatzi Hallel, meaning we leave out something. And there are different reasons that are given, but one reason that is given by the Shibbolei Leket is that since the seventh day of Pesach commemorates the splitting of the Red Sea, and the angels were told not to sing a song of praise to God, so we too have to diminish our Hallel because we have to reflect a certain Rachmanut for the Egyptians. Now you may ask a kasha, the Taz asked the question, okay, so we should only do a half Hallel on the seventh day of Pesach. All the other days ought to be a full Hallel. So the Taz says, well, you got to work backwards. You never want Chol HaMoed to be more significant than a Chag. So since the seventh day of Pesach is a Chag, and you're going to downgrade to a half Hallel, then you got to go backwards and make it a half Hallel for every other day. Okay, that's what the Taz says. But now I want to ask a simple question. If we only say a half Hallel because we don't want to celebrate excessively the loss of life, then what about the first day of Pesach? The first day of Pesach, plenty of Egyptians died. That was Makas Bechoros. The firstborn of Egypt died. So why do I say a full Hallel? Make the same argument. Ma'aseh Yadai Tovu B'Yam. And if you're going to give me the answer, well, I really don't care about the Egyptians, it was our night of redemption. Well, seventh day, the same thing. In other words, there are two attitudes one can have here. One attitude might be called particularism. As long as it's good for the Jews, I don't care what happened to the Goyim. Or there's an attitude called universalism. I care about all human suffering. So you can be one or the other. But how come on the first day of Pesach we are particularists? If it's good for the Jews, okay, what happened to the Goyim is what happened to the Goyim. Like I even celebrate that, Dayenu, right? If Hashem would have killed the firstborn and not given us the money, Dayenu. So, how do you explain the fact that we start off Pesach as particularists, concerned only for our parochial interests, but by the time we reach Kriyat Yam Suf, we become universalists? Ma'aseh Yadai Tovu B'Yam. Right? What happened? What happened in the middle here? So let's start with an explanation of the Beis Halevi. Beis Halevi was the first Soloveitchik that was the Rav of Brisk. He was Rav Chaim Soloveitchik's father, Rav Yasher Beer's namesake. Okay. Is that fun here? Okay. And he raises an interesting observation. If you think about the 10 Makos, and you think about Kriyas Yam Suf, you actually see an interesting opposite phenomenon. In the case of the Makos, the miracle was always the punishment of the Makkah, and the sparing of the Jewish people was simply leaving them to the natural order. Blood. The miracle was the water turned into blood. The Jewish people were left to the order of nature that water was water. There was no miracle done for the Jewish people. The miracle was the punishment. Blood, dam, Sephardeia, Kinim, Orov, all of them. Makas Bechoros. The Nes was the Onesh. The Hatzalah was the Teva. Kriyas Yam Suf. Think about this. Kriyas Yam Suf was the very first time that the miracle itself was the vehicle that saved us. The Egyptians did not die miraculously. Again, there are midrashim that say the Egyptians died unique deaths, etc. But if you simply look at the psukim, The Egyptians did not die by a miraculous divine intervention. Rather, God simply removed the miracle of keeping the water apart. And once the water is no longer subject to a miracle, it naturally comes together, and that killed the Egyptians. Which means all of the makos, the nes was the onesh, and the hatzala was the teva. Kriyas Yamsuf, the nes was the hatzala, and the onesh was the teva. Okay, that's a very interesting observation. But why is that so important? The reason that's so important is that Mitzrayim, the makos in Mitzrayim, demonstrated that God will change the laws of nature to punish evildoers in the world. Right? Hashem turned the water into blood, Sephardeia, Kinim. The whole purpose of the makos was to demonstrate God's might, God's power, God's control over nature, but in the direction of being ma'anish risha'im. And that taught the Jewish people an important lesson, that God ultimately fights injustice in one way or the other. There will be punishment, there will be accountability. Therefore, the Beis Halevi writes, the dominant emotion that we acquired when we left Mitzrayim was Yiras Hashem, fear of God and reverence for God. Because God showed me I better behave in life. Because if I misbehave, there are serious, devastating consequences. But Kriyas Yamsuf gave us another picture. Kriyas Yamsuf, Hashem changed the natural order, not to punish, because the Egyptians were not punished by the miracle. God changed the natural order to redeem. As a result, Kriyas Yamsuf, we experienced the love of God at a much deeper level than we experienced even in Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim, we also experienced the love of God. He redeemed us. But Kriyas Yamsuf, Hashem changed the natural order of the universe to redeem us. So Kriyas Yamsuf, we are margish, we experience Hashem's love for us. Now, there's a pasuk in Mishlei, Kamayim haponim el ponim, Kain lev ha'adam li adam. Beautiful, beautiful pasuk. This is something you can put on your refrigerator as a motto. As water reflects the face that you show it, so too the heart of one person reflects that which it receives. What's the pshat? I look into a pool of water. Whatever face I show the water is the face I get back. I smile at the water, I see a smiling face. I frown at the water, I see a frowning face. What I show is what is reflected back to me. Shlomo HaMelech says the same way a reflecting pool of water reflects what you show it. The heart of a human being reflects what you show that person. I show somebody love, respect, care, concern. They will feel that way towards me. I show them disregard, that's how they'll feel towards me. In fact, in many, many ways, this pasuk could actually be the secret to resolving religious and secular tensions. Because for some reason, the argumentative style of the Middle East generally is that you always demonize the other side. You know, maybe I still have my American bad habits with me, you know, the idea of trying to find common ground, but Normally I would think that if you say something I disagree with, I would try to do something like, well, I hear what you're saying, but maybe you could modify it, etc. Try to find a mivneh mishutav, kind of a common denominator. But the way it works here is, you're an idiot. You're not partially right. You have no point at all. Now what happens is, I say this person's an idiot, the other person thinks I'm an idiot. So as a result, in religious secular issues, one side calls the secular Amalek, and the other side calls the religious parasite, whatever particular way it goes. And it just spirals and spirals and goes on and on and on and on and on, and nothing ever ends. I once saw, there was an organization called Common Denominator. I don't know if they're still going on. It's probably still around. I once saw ground rules. This was a way of trying to facilitate religious secular communication. So they actually had it in the ground rules. No throwing of chairs. That was a rule they had to put in to be sure, we will not allow throwing of chairs, whatever it would be. But if you start from the other premise, I acknowledge you. I hear what you're saying. You are making a point. But would you also consider this? Then you have Shlomo HaMelech's promise that what you show towards the other person, he will be reflected back to you. Mayim apanim apanim. So, how does this apply by Kriyas Yamsuf? If Kriyas Yamsuf was the time that we felt God's love more than even in Mitzrayim. Why did we feel God's love? Because he did a miracle, not to punish. He did a miracle to redeem. When we feel God's love, when God gives love to us, our heart gives love back to God. The same principle, kamayim apanim apanim, that applies in human relationships. The Balatanya writes, also applies in divine relationships. The more you are aware of Hashem's love, the more your love for Hashem grows. So, what emerges from this is, when we left Mitzrayim, we were suffused with Yiras Hashem. Kriyas Yamsuf, because we experienced a higher level of Hashem's love for us, we were suffused with Avas Hashem. Now, why is that important? Because when you live in the world of Yira, your concerns are parochial. I want to be sure I don't get punished. I want to be sure I get rewarded. I want to be sure my family is protected. That is the motivation of Yira. Avoda me'yira is, I want to be good because I don't want to suffer negative consequences. So when you live in the world of Yira, the only thing you focus on is what's good for you. You really don't care about collateral damage. Yeah, a lot of Egyptians died, but okay, that's not my concern. So on the first day of Pesach, which is celebrating Avoda Me'yira, you say a whole Hallel. It was good for the Jews. But when you live in a relationship where you love God, so here is the thing. Part of loving, let's talk about loving another person. Part of loving another person is you try to see the world through their eyes. Right? For a husband and wife, that's a difficult challenge. Men and women, as the Gemara says, men and women are two different nations. Actually, it's a lashon in the Gemara. So it's very, very difficult. But that is a person's avoda in marriage, both from the husband and the wife's perspective. I want to understand how you feel. I want to see the world through your eyes too. So by extension, when you love God, you want to look at the world through God's eyes, not just your eyes. And from God's eyes, every human being is precious. From God's eyes, the death of the Egyptians is a tragedy. So the reason why there's a progression from particularism to universalism is that is the movement of avoda based on yira to avoda based on ava. Avoda based on ava means you're no longer focusing on what's good for me. Yeah, sure, it was good for me that the Egyptians died. But from God's perspective, there was a sadness, although it had to be done. And it properly had to be done. But there's a sadness. And when I'm an Oved Me'ava, I will try to feel that sadness as well. Because that's what Hashem feels. And that is how it's expressed halachically. Now, you might ask a very, very strong question on everything that I said. So according to what we're saying, Yetziat Mitzrayim was the experience of serving Hashem out of yira, and Kriyas Yamsuf is serving Hashem out of love, because we feel God's love. But that's not what the pasuk says. When the pasuk talks about Kriyas Yamsuf, it says, "Vayar Yisrael es hayad hagdola asher asa Hashem b'Mitzrayim." The Jewish people saw the great, powerful hands that God put against the Egyptians. Vayiru ha'am es Hashem, and they feared or revered Hashem. That's Kriyas Yamsuf. V'yaminu b'Hashem, and they believed in Hashem. Uba Moshe Avdo, and in Moshe. By the way, that pasuk is quoted in the Haggadah, and that is the only time Moshe Rabbeinu's name is in the Haggadah. So if your kids are restless or grandchildren are restless, and you want to give them an assignment, you can say you'll give a little prize to anyone who will tell me when Moshe Rabbeinu's name is mentioned. But the problem is, by Kriyas Yamsuf, it says Yira. It doesn't say Abba. Vayiru es Hashem. But the answer is this. The answer is, there are different types of Yira as well. You know, we're familiar with Yira. Yira itself has two basic types. There is fear of punishment. I better behave because there's punishment. That's a discipline thing. And then there's Yira, which is awe and reverence. And then there's love of God, which is higher. But then there's a third Yira that's even higher than love. So there's Yira 1, Yira 2, Ava, and then there's Yira 3 that's higher than Ava. And Yira 3 is an intensification of love that is so strong that you are afraid to do a sin, not because you're afraid of punishment, but you don't want to bring pain to the one that you love. So, let's say a husband is deeply, loves his wife, and he has to get up early, and his wife is sleeping. So he may be afraid to make any noise that will wake her up. Now, what is he afraid of? Is he afraid that you'll hit him with a frying pan? Well, maybe, that could be, but usually, that would be fear of punishment. Is it because he's in awe of her? It's like waking up Queen Elizabeth or something? No, he's not in awe of her. The fear is a different fear. It's to love. I love somebody. I care about them. I am afraid. I'm tiptoeing. I'm afraid to do something that will bring them pain. So, when it says they had Yira by Kriyas Yamsuf, it does not mean Yira of either fear of punishment or awe. That we got in Mitzrayim. But it refers to the Madrega of Yira, which is an intensification of love. And it's a little meduyak that way, because in most of the Torah, when it describes Yira, it always says Yirat Elokim. Elokim is the midah of din and punishment. Here it says, Vayiru ha'am et Hashem. Yud Kei Vav Kei is the name of Rachamim. So it's an unusual juxtaposition to have Yira with the Shem Havaya, but if we understand it this way, it's a beautiful point, because what it's basically saying is, because we experienced Hashem's mercy at us, that awakens in our heart a love for Hashem, and that love generates a fear not to do anything that will impair that love. And that's why v'yiru ha'am es Hashem b'dafka, and not Elokim. In Rosh Chodesh benching, in the prayer that we recite, Shabbos Mevorchim, the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh. So we ask Hashem for a number of things, right? And one of them is Chayim sheyesh bahem yirat shamayim v'yirat chet. A life that has fear of heaven, fear of God, and fear of sin. What exactly is the difference? So this is the difference. Yirat Shamayim includes the two lower levels of Yira. Yiras HaOnesh, and awe and reverence for God, Shamayim. Yiras Chet is not fear of God, it's fear of the sin, because it'll bring God pain, and God is the object of your love. So Yiras Chet is actually a madrega that is mekushar to Ava rather than Yira. Yiras Shamayim is Yira. Yiras Chet is the intensification of Ava, and therefore what was acquired at Kriyas Yamsuf was Yiras Chet, Vayira Es Hashem, that comes from an awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's love. As Kamayim Upanim Upanim, when we feel Hashem's love, our hearts feel a greater love towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, I wish you all a good week and a happy Tu B'Shvat next week, and Mr. Hashem will see you.
Yiboneh Archives,